Aerial Transit Corridor, Northeastern Sector, United States of America. The transport jet settled into its heading, angling into a course that would follow the eastern seaboard all the way up to Newfoundland before turning to strike out across the Atlantic. Once they were at stable altitude, all the members of the Tyrant team had taken Namir's orders to heart and returned to their cramped cabins in the aircraft's midsection. The lighting dimmed to night flight levels. They would not see day again until they reached the airspace of the European Union. Saxon waited 20 minutes, listening at the wall to be certain of no other movement out in the corridor. Then, with care, he eased open the door to his cabin and slipped back out, moving forward with all the stealth he could muster. The only weapon he had on him was a buzzkill stun gun, although he wondered if the taser pistol would be enough to put down any of the tyrants. He was on a mission of his own making now. Discovery would mean failure and worse. In another pocket, he had the disposable VU phone. Waiting in the cabin, he had read and reread the message sent by Janice, committing it to memory before erasing the text. Melina, he turned the name over in his thoughts. Saxon tried to imagine a younger Jaren Namir, a man and not the lethal cyborg that he knew. He tried to picture that young Namir dealing with the death of someone close to him. Had it hardened him, he wondered, made him callous to the suffering of others, put him on the path to who he had become? Saxon frowned and dismissed the thought. Whatever secrets Namir had, if this worked, he would learn them soon enough. He threaded his way along the length of the jet to the stairs dropping to the lower level. Crouching, Saxon carefully placed each silent footfall, keeping in the lines of shadow along the main corridor. Blinks of light from the wingtip navigation indicators on the jet's wings cast faint halos of color over his shoulders through the oval windows. Saxon knelt in the lee of a support frame and cycled through the variant modes of his optics. Through the partition walls, he picked out the faint heat blobs of the two-man flight crew up toward the cockpit area, while at the aft, in the operations center, the only colors were the dull green-blue glow of the idling computer systems. Saxon entered the ops room and closed the door behind him. Keeping low, he threaded his way to Namir's console and tapped the glassy surface. The panel came to life, immediately demanding a passcode. He let out a breath to steady himself and tapped out the first string of symbols. Melina's date of birth. The panel chimed a warning. The code was wrong. The sound seemed like a shout in the quiet of the dormant room among the low murmur of the computers. Saxon waited for a moment, one hand on the stun gun, but no one came to investigate. He went on. The second code string was also incorrect. A fail on the third attempt would lock down the console and doubtless trigger some kind of alert. But the list of potential passwords Janice had provided had more than 3 variations. He ran them through his thoughts again. Namir's sister. His daughter. A simple code. It would not be complex, Saxon realized. Namir wasn't that kind of man, not one to waste time on needless subterfuge. He was direct. There were no shades of gray to him. Saxon thought about people he had lost, people he had felt responsible for, and then he typed in the name of the dead woman as it might have appeared on her gravestone, plain and unaltered. The console unlocked and bloomed with new display windows, welcoming him into the main lines of its data store. Saxon's eyes narrowed as he saw line after line of files labeled with places, dates, names. Targets. There were hundreds of people listed here, and they were all objectives for the tyrants. He scrolled through the names, looking for points of commonality, struggling to understand. There were men like Mikhail Kontarsky, high-profile figures linked to criminal groups like the Hong Kong Triads and the Russian Bratva, others tagged as in collusion with terrorists and activists. Juggernaut, Lomber, Purity First, and others. On the surface, people who looked like bad guys, up to their necks in illegality. But Saxon had only to scratch the surface to find lists of action orders ranged against the names of civilians, politicians, scientists, people the tyrants had no business going against. Some of the orders were straight kill commands, others ghosted under setups that would appear as suicides, robberies gone wrong, accidents. A few were tagged as coercive, no deaths there, instead the application of violence and intimidation. Saxon felt betrayed. The mission of the tyrants, the reason he had allowed himself to be recruited by Namir, was a lie. The faceless men of the group giving the orders were not using them to help maintain global stability. They were using them as enforcers, eradicating anyone who might prove dangerous to them, killing or intimidating all across the planet. He picked a handful of files at random and opened them. June Sellers, Department of Homeland Security, terminated. Donald Teague, advisory staffer on the United Nations Science Council, terminated. Martine Delancourt, founder of the French Bioethics Association, terminated. Garrett Dansky, CEO of Caden Global, terminated. Ryutaka Hanada, cybernetics research scientist at Isolate, terminated. The list went on, and among it all, Saxon found the data on the men he had surveilled in Glasgow and Bucharest. One was a technology researcher on the payroll of the British government, the other a politician. Both files had additional information beyond what he had turned over to Namir. There were still images, digital shots of a body in an alleyway, throat slit and pale, another of a car on fire. Neither man had been a criminal, but clearly someone had considered them a threat. Now they were both dead, both killed by the tyrants. He saw expedited code tags on the files bearing the idents green and red. Scott Hardesty, Yelena Fedorova. Saxon closed the files and sat in the dimness and silence, musing on what he had seen, silently cursing his own stupidity. At first, he hadn't wanted to think too hard about what he was doing, about what the meaning of the tyrants might be. It was only as time had passed that the nagging disquiet in the back of his thoughts had grown to a ceaseless churn, and now that he had an idea of the truth, it made his blood run cold. He thought about Janice's repeated question and nodded grimly. "Do you know what master you serve?" He was beginning to build a picture, and he didn't like what he saw. This was what the tyrants did. This is who they were, and he was a part of it. With a quick glance over his shoulder to make sure he was still alone, Saxon brought up a search function and keyed in the phrase "killing floor." He wasn't sure what he had expected to see. The name drew up ideas of some kind of arena, perhaps something like the fight room in Namir's home. Why the members of Juggernaut were so eager to find it was beyond him, but instead of opening a file, the computer showed a new set of data panes. It took Saxon a few seconds to realize what he was seeing. The console launched an interface protocol via an encrypted tight beam signal to an orbiting communications satellite, and then on into the global web of data net connections. On the screen, the killing floor unfolded, a virtual space existing in a realm of pure information. Shielded by layers of smart attack barrier programs, firewalls, and baffles, the non-place was a shifting island in a sea of data. Program nodes contained files at levels of encryption so powerful that the console read them as impregnable, spiked spheres. But there were other panels of text that were clearly visible, doubtless open for Namir or anyone with the same access level. Saxon read them, but in isolation there was little he could glean. He saw references to Fedorova's current mission, to the primary target Namir had mentioned in passing, but who or where that person was did not make itself clear. He frowned, activating the VU phone's wireless link, starting the process to copy the contact protocols from the jet's mainframe. It was clear that the killing floor had no true physical reality to it. It was a synthetic server construct, a clever agglomeration of computer programs moving through the data net in a chaotic, unpredictable pattern that no outsider, no hacker, could ever hope to calculate. Without the locational key to gain access, there was no other way in. How could you break into a fortress you couldn't find? It was an encrypted virtual space, reachable in seconds from any location on Earth if one was granted clearance. A place where the group could exchange target information with the tyrants, with what fear of ever being overheard. It was the digital equivalent of a piece of espionage tradecraft over 100 years old, the dead drop. The VU phone chimed, signaling the conclusion of the data transfer. Saxon wasn't willing to risk using the device to contact Janice, not yet at least. After they landed in Europe, maybe then. But before that, there was still one more thing he had to do. He entered 2 words into the search protocol and waited. Instantly, a file tagged with numerous security flags unfolded before him. There, laid out in stark text in emotionless, clipped terms, was the reality of what had happened during Operation Rainbird. A dark, fearful impulse made Saxon hesitate. Part of him didn't want to know. He wanted to disconnect, to erase the file and bury the memories of that night deep. But that would be a betrayal of Sam and Kano and the other members of Strike Six, of himself, of the truth. Saxon began to read, and as he did, he felt himself detach from the moment, losing all sense of where he was. In his ears, he heard the rattle of gunfire and the howling of torn metal. He felt the heat of fuel fires on his bare skin and the sting of burning plastic and spent cordite in his nostrils. It was as if no time had passed, and he was there again on the Gray Range, fighting to stay alive. What he read on the screen hollowed him out. He saw the reports from the Bell Tower recon, the intelligence profiles of enemy strength and numbers, the warnings of sleeper drones. And with them, he saw mirrors of the same data, only with all threat and nuance carefully bled out of them. Fabricated reports showing the area of operations for the Rainbird mission clear of enemy contact. Lies and more lies, dressed up like truth. A truth Ben Saxon had accepted without question. A truth that had cost his men their lives. He heard the crunch of metal and glanced down. His augmented hand had fractured the arm of the seat he was sitting in. Sucking in a breath, he released his grip and glared back at the screen. Where has this false data come from? How long has Namir had it in his possession? Saxon's jaw set hard, and his thoughts turned toward darker places. When he heard Namir's voice call his name, it didn't come as a surprise. "You're a very good soldier, Ben," said Namir from the ops room doorway. "But there's something you lack." Saxon saw the other man in the computer screen, a warped reflection of those hard eyes and that scarred face. "Enlighten me." "You can't see where the line is. You don't know how to compartmentalize yourself. You're not willing to make that sacrifice." Namir took a casual step into the ops room. "That's what we have to do, put up walls around the parts of our souls we want to keep sacrosanct. Barriers to protect our humanity." Saxon tensed. "Is that what you do?" He thought of the man in the photo at the house, the father and husband. "You're one man in here, with us? Out there, you're someone else?" He rose slowly, his fury building. "That's not something to be proud of. That's a pattern of psychosis." Namir shook his head slowly. "You're very good at what you do, Ben. But inside, you're weak. You can't let go. I thought that might change after what happened in Queensland. I had hopes." "Were you a part of that?" Saxon pointed at the screen and his voice rose. "Is this about those bastards holding your bloody leash?" Namir's tone never altered. "I want you to think very carefully about what you say next, because this is the most important choice you will ever make. What happened in Moscow, then in the house in London, those things were not the tests of your character or your loyalty." He gestured to the monitor. "This is the test, Ben. This is what will define who you are and your future with the tyrants. Do you understand? I need to know if you can be like me, like the rest of us." Saxon's gorge rose. He was sickened by the other man's words, revolted by the thought of what black and poisonous truth lay behind them. "Like you?" he husked. "You don't hide your humanity away, Namir. You only tell yourself that you do. The truth is, you're not human anymore. You've lost that, you and Hardesty, Fedorova, and the others. You're a weapon that thinks like a man." The other man gave a weary sigh. "That's a shame. I really wanted you to understand. I hate to see great potential wasted." "Tell me what you did." Saxon spat, his voice rising to a shout. "Tell me." Namir's gaze never wavered as his metallic hand curled into a fist. "Do you know what real strength is, Ben? Sacrifice. Aerial transit corridor, Gulf of St. Lawrence, North Atlantic. It was as if the blood had been drained from him. Saxon was suddenly an empty vessel, echoing and cold. In all the years of battle in conflict zones across the globe, in those moments when death had been a heartbeat away from claiming him, he had never felt the same slow, sickening shock that swept about him now. Carefully, he gathered up the VU phone and pocketed it, moving slowly to keep one of the ops room consoles between him and Namir. "I'll give you the truth, if you want it," said the tyrant commander. "There's little point in being coy about it now." "Operation Rainbird." Saxon ground out the words like pieces of broken glass. "What did you do?" Namir sighed. "I wish I could make it clear to you how lucky you are, Ben. Recruitment into the tyrants is not a reward that just anyone is given. You need to be superlative. You need to be more than just a fool with a gun." He walked a little farther into the room, and Saxon stiffened as he felt the floor shift slightly beneath their feet. The jet was banking, turning eastward. Namir went on, "You were on the radar a long time before I came to you in Queensland. We have ongoing dossiers on many potentials. Our missions have a high level of attrition. Fatalities like Joe Wexler are a regular occurrence." "Get to the point," snapped Saxon. "Oh, I will, but you have to see the big picture first." Namir nodded to himself and pointed. "You were in the prime percentile, Ben. All that was stopping you were your shortcomings. We freed you from that." "What?" He could feel the dark answer coming. On some level, he already knew, and he didn't want to hear it. He didn't want it to be true. Wexler, it took his wife's death to bring him into the fold. Now, Gunther Herman, he was a very different subject, much more direct. The group made certain problems he had in Germany go away, and in return, he was in our debt. Not that what he owed mattered. He came to the tyrants willingly, eyes open. But you? Namir cocked his head, weighing Saxon up. "The man I wanted for my team, the man I know you can be, he was being held back." He nodded again. "Throughout your entire military service, first to king and country, then to bell tower, you've been shackled to some kind of outdated moral compass. You have a dream of being the good soldier. And while other men have had that beaten from them by harsh reality, you hold on to it, Ben. Against all odds, you hold on. That's why you never rose in rank. We've both been leaders of men, and that means sometimes you have to send men to die and do it without flinching." "I'd never make my men take a risk I wouldn't take myself," he shot back. "Indeed," Namir allowed. "That's your failure. You've been abandoned by every family you had, your parents, your nation, your army, your employer, and yet still you refuse to see the callous truth. You're blinded by your own hope." He smiled. "I took that from you. I broke those bonds because I thought it would make you stronger. The falsified data for the mission, you had it substituted for the real thing." Saxon's muscles tensed. He wanted to strike out, but he had to know the full dimensions of the betrayal. "How?" "We have assets inside the Bell Tower Corporation." "It wasn't difficult." He sighed. "Those men, they were a hindrance to you. They had to be sacrificed. It was a test. If you perished there in the desert alongside them, then you had no place with us. But if you came out alone—" "I tried to save them," Saxon shouted. "Duarte, I could have saved his life." "He was expendable," Namir countered. "They all were. I gave Hardesty the order to break Rainbird because I needed to know. I wanted to see if you were willing to live, Ben. If you had the courage to survive." Saxon's voice was low and hard. "You heartless fucking bastard." His hands slipped toward the pocket where the buzzkill was concealed, but the weapon would be barely an insect bite to the tyrant commander, with dermal armor sheathing what there was of his flesh. "Survivor's guilt, that, and your instinct to be loyal to a man who saved your life." Namir studied him. "The psych profile said that was all I needed to control you, but these things are so hard to determine. The human mind is a chaotic system. And as much as men are exactly the animals you expect them to be, sometimes they are not." He frowned. "I don't need to ask you to choose. I can see the answer in your eyes. You can't let go. Hardesty was right. You don't have the strength to kill cold. I'm pleased I can prove you wrong." With a blink, Saxon shifted vision modes, getting ready. Namir drew a wicked-looking combat blade from a sheath on his belt. "You're going to fight for it, aren't you?" he asked. "At least show me that courage. Let me know my faith in you wasn't entirely misplaced." Saxon drew the stun gun and thumbed off the safety catch. The other man laughed. "Oh, that's a choice you'll regret," he sneered. Saxon met his gaze. "I'm not going to use it on you." The reflex booster kicked in, and he brought up the non-lethal weapon, firing 2 rounds into the flat, glassy surface of the main display console. The stun darts, thick shells the size of a shotgun cartridge, discharged a powerful surge of voltage on impact. The console erupted in a violent shower of sparks and acrid smoke. Surge buffers in the ops room tripped, plunging it into darkness, but Saxon was already seeing the space in low light mode. Namir reacted, sweeping in with a lunging, lethal attack that Saxon dodged by a hair, the blade cutting the air near his face. The stink of burnt plastic reached the fire sensors in the ceiling and immediately triggered a carillon of buzzing alarms. Saxon snatched at a monitor screen and tore it from a desk, with a snake nest of cables trailing behind it. As puffs of fire-retardant powder began to rain from safety nozzles overhead, he slammed the display into Namir's head with such force that the screen shattered, and the tyrant commander staggered back under the blow. Saxon took the moment and vaulted over a workstation and into the corridor beyond. As he ran, the familiar itch in his jawbone arose, Namir's voice issuing out of his mastoid comm. "All call signs, ignore the alarms," he snarled. "Gray is rogue. Intercept and terminate." Aerial transit corridor, Gulf of St. Lawrence, North Atlantic. Saxon tried to think of a worse tactical situation he had been in, and came up empty. Trapped on board an airborne jet, with 4 heavily augmented mercenaries and no means of escape, armed only with a couple of rounds of stun dart ammo that was nearly useless against these adversaries. Yeah, it's pretty grim, he told himself. About the only positive point he could find was that without Fedorova among them, at least he would see the other tyrants coming. He wondered how much good that would do him. Despite Namir's commands, the fire alarms were still in full effect, but retardants had only been triggered inside the ops room. Saxon moved quickly through the galley area, panning the buzzkill this way and that, going forward. His mind raced through the tactical options open to him. He had to make a choice. He needed a better weapon, something lethal, and he needed it fast. He could set up a quick and dirty ambush, try to kill one of the others when they came for him, and take their gun, but that would cost him time. The second option would be to get into the cockpit, lock himself in there, and force the crew to land the jet on the nearest piece of ground, maybe Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. Without at least one pilot, he'd have to handle the aircraft alone, and Saxon wasn't willing to trust himself on that score. With his rudimentary understanding of piloting, the best he could do in that case was ditch in the coastal shallows and hope he survived. Every second he spent deliberating, they were getting farther and farther away from land. He nodded to himself. Take the plane, then, he thought. Figure the rest out later. He could hear noises behind him. Namir hadn't come back on the mastoid comm after his first announcement, and Saxon imagined he'd be passing a new channel assignment to each of the others by hand. Another reason to move fast. Once they were ready, they'd box him in, and that would be that. He thought about weapons again. At least it cut both ways. None of the standard-issue firearms used by the tyrants could be discharged inside the jet, not without taking the risk of overpenetration. A 10mm round could pass right through flesh and punch a hole in the fuselage, causing a catastrophic depressurization, Saxon grimaced. Back down the length of the aircraft, there was a weapons locker stocked with all he needed. A crossbow, maybe? A pulse gun? But he was thinking like Namir, and Namir would have posted someone there already. He'd have to make do. Saxon checked his pockets for anything he could use, and his fingers touched the VU phone. He drew it out and considered it for a second before hitting the redial key. There was a good chance he wasn't going to get out of this alive. If he could make his last few minutes count, maybe contact the hacker movement from the corner of his eye spun him around, and he forgot the phone, coming up with the buzzkill. He saw a flash of spiked blonde hair and a figure in black combat gear burst from the shadow of a storage cabinet. Gunther Hermann collided with Saxon with such force that they were both propelled across the galley and through a folding partition into the next anteroom. "This time it will be different," Hermann snarled. "I think I will enjoy this." He struck out with a storm of blows that made Saxon's skull ring, lighting flares of pain behind his eyes. Blood hazed his vision, and he threw a punch that cut empty air, but little else. Hermann came in and hit him again. Each shot to the head was like taking a hit from a sledgehammer. Saxon's body possessed a base level of subdermal armor, the Rhino-class augmentation commonplace on Bell Tower Spec Ops soldiers, but it wouldn't be enough to prevent the German's rain of punches, pushing him into a concussion. He had to stop the mercenary, and he had to do it quickly. Hermann had learned his lesson from their brief battle in the fight room, moving constantly, using his nerve-jacked speed to stay outside the swings from Saxon's cyber arm. He punched at air, drawing a sneer from the German. He feinted into another haymaker that the younger man easily sidestepped. But while Saxon's other arm was only meat and bone, it was still deadly. His attention fixed on his opponent's augmentations, Hermann stepped into Saxon's range and he rushed him. He slammed the heel of his palm upward, breaking the other man's nose, and rode the momentum of the attack. Saxon's augmented legs powered him back across the cabin, with Herman shoved out before him. The mercenary slammed into a glass-fronted refrigerator and crumpled with a cry of pain. Saxon punched him hard in the chest, feeling the satisfying crunch of bone breaking beneath the blow. But Herman would not submit, and he scrambled to extract himself from the debris, cursing in his native language. Saxon drew the buzzkill and fired a single, close-range shot. The electro dart punctured Herman's right eye, the discharge wreathing his head in a brief flash of lighting. Howling, he fell to the deck, wisps of smoke rising from burnt skin and hair. "Stay down," Saxon warned, and left him there, heading forward. Hardesty was waiting in the corridor leading to the cockpit. He announced himself with the crash from a Widowmaker. Saxon dove for cover, bracing himself for the inevitable tornado of depressurization. But instead he caught the edges of a spatter of gooey matter that chugged into the air. Specks of it touched his bare skin and burned. The sniper was firing crowdbuster rounds, saboted cartridges that burst in the air and coated targets with a sticky mess of contact irritants. Saxon resisted the urge to tear at his inflamed skin and swore. The fluid wasn't lethal, but it hurt like hell. And right on cue, Hardesty called out to him. "They say this crap can kill a man if he takes a shot to the face, makes your throat swell up, chokes the air from you." He snorted. "Always wanted to see if that was true. Let me try it out." Saxon checked the stun gun, 1 round remaining. At this range, he'd do as much damage with harsh language. Gingerly, he peered out from cover. Hardesty was blocking the entrance to the cockpit, and behind him a door of reinforced steel and plastic closed off the path to the flight deck. If Hardesty had made it up here ahead of him, then Saxon knew his entry code to get that door open was now null and void. Any hope of taking the plane was lost. Now he had to worry about staying alive. Somewhere behind or below him, Namir and Barrett were still in the game. Across the corridor, there was a stairwell leading to the other deck, but to reach it, he would pass right in front of Hardesty and give him ample time to unload the rest of the auto shotgun loads into him. Think fast. He ducked back just as Hardesty poked the Widowmaker's muzzle out and let off a triple-shot salvo. Saxon tasted vaporized capsicum in the air and winced at the acid tang in his throat. Above him, a portable fire extinguisher the size of a wine bottle sat in a recessed alcove. He snatched it from the clip, securing it in place, and held it like a club, bringing it down on the arm of a chair at the point where the discharge nozzle joined the foam canister. It bent on the first hit, and he repeated the action. "What the hell are you doing?" Hardesty called. "Trying to dig your way out." On the second strike, the joint dented, and a hiss of escaping gases puffed white spray into the air. The third hit dislodged the nozzle, and suddenly the canister was a fountain of cold, smothering vapor. Saxon hurled it down the corridor and heard Hardesty cry out in surprise as the makeshift gas bomb filled the enclosed space with choking mist. Saxon vaulted toward the stairwell under cover of the distraction. Even as Hardesty fired blindly, fluid-filled shells splattering all around him. He mistimed the jump and stumbled on the metal staircase, almost tumbling headlong. Recovering, he broke into a run back down the length of the jet, kicking open the door to the main cargo bay. Beyond it was the rearmost compartment and the stowed helo. There were weapons on board the flyer. If he could reach them. Something caught his ankle. For a second he thought the aircraft was banking, but then he was spinning around and the deck came up to slam him in the face. Saxon scrambled to get up. "Watch your step." Barrett emerged from behind a cargo pod, pausing to bring down a heavy boot on the stun gun, lying where it had fallen from Saxon's pocket. He crushed the plastic ceramic weapon with a grunt and eyed him. "Namir?" he said to the air. "I got him. Cargo deck, toward the tail section." Saxon never heard the reply, but the grin that blossomed on Barrett's scarred face made it clear what was said. "Got it. Be a pleasure." The big man came forward, and like a complex mechanical toy, his right arm unfolded to allow a tri-barreled minigun to emerge. "Go ahead, arsehole," Saxon taunted. "One shot from that cannon and you'll rip the hull open." Barrett gave a thoughtful nod. "Good point, Benny boy. In all the excitement, I kind of forgot myself there." He laid his Missouri accent on thick, drawing out the moment as the weapon retracted. It was something Saxon had learned early on about the mercenary. Barrett liked to play up his brutish image, but he was more than just a thug. He liked people to underestimate him. "Guess I'll just rip you limb from limb then," he added, striding forward. "Shame. I kinda liked you." Saxon backed off, eyes darting around for a weapon. Barrett had come ready for anything, wearing the heavy anti-blast vest that was his signature operations kit. Nothing short of an armor-piercing round would cut through it. Barrett made a mock-sad face. "Ah, what's wrong? You don't want to dance?" He stalked forward, grabbing a metal spacer rod from atop one of the cargo racks. The big man made a couple of lazy practice swings. "We'll try something else then. Batter up!" Saxon dodged as Barrett attacked, sweeping the rod through the air. He was running out of room, his opponent backing him into the curved wall of the fuselage. "Namir's lying to you," he shouted. "He killed my last crew just to get me here. You can't trust him." "Gee, you're right. Maybe we should team up. Kick his ass. How about that?" Barrett snorted, nostrils flaring around the bull ring through his nose. His expression became cold and hard. "You don't get it. We're on the winning side here. Anyone else, you're just little people." He snarled and attacked again, this time bringing down the steel rod in a falling overhead blow. Saxon threw up his augmented arm and blocked the strike, the impact singing through the metal right down to the meat interface at his shoulder joint, fragments of carbon plastic cracking under the force of the blow. He followed through with a hard punch to the chest, but the strike might have been a love tap for all the effect it had. Barrett hit him with the near end of the rod, and Saxon staggered. First the fight with Herman, and now this. The pain was dragging on him. He couldn't keep this up for too long. Even his iron stamina had its limits. Barrett discarded his makeshift weapon and grabbed Saxon with both hands, snatching at fistfuls of his jacket. He picked up the other man and roared with effort as he slammed him to one side, into a cargo rack, and then back again. Barrett had maybe Saxon's body mass and half as much again, and most of it was cybernetics. The man was a tank. Dizzy, his vision blurring, it was all Saxon could do to keep conscious. Barrett's arms drew tight and dragged him into a bear hug. The breath left his lungs in a wheeze, and he tasted blood in his mouth. He was going to black out. It was only a matter of seconds. "My daddy was a mean son of a bitch, but he was right about one thing," Barrett laughed. "He used to tell me, 'Mess with the bull, son, and you get the horns.'" Saxon channeled the last of his effort into resisting the crushing embrace. "Shut the fuck up!" he snapped, jerking his head forward and down, butting the other man on the bridge of the nose. Barrett cried out in pain, and for a fraction of a moment, his grip loosened. That was all Saxon needed. He got his hands free and snatched at the twin bandoliers over Barrett's shoulders. His fingers found the pull rings on the yellow and black shock-tack concussion grenades hanging there, and he yanked hard. "You stupid!" Barrett immediately released him and staggered backward, clawing at the live grenades. Saxon let himself fall and rolled toward one of the cargo racks. A massive, ear-splitting blast of light and noise tore through the confined space, deadening Saxon's hearing into a painful humming whine. Barrett was on his back, blown into a collapsed pile of storage panniers, coughing up blood. Trails of red oozed from his ears, nostrils, and the corners of his eyes. Saxon forced himself to stagger away, breathing hard, lurching toward the tail section. It was hard to focus. He had to reach the helo, the weapons locker. And then what? His plan was sand, crumbling, falling though his fingers. There was nowhere he could go. A shadow shifted in front of him, caught by the light cast from the glow strips on the low ceiling. Saxon half turned. The endless shriek in his ears stopped him hearing the approach of a new attack. Half blind and enraged, Barrett came at him, grabbing Saxon from behind and locking his hands behind his head. He applied agonizing force, pressing into the bones of Saxon's neck. The American shouted, and Saxon heard the words more than he felt them. "You think that'll stop me? You think you can stop me?" Saxon hit back with elbow strikes, but the vice-like pressure was unceasing. He cast around, knowing that death was close. Not here. Not like this. Not yet. Fitted into the curve of the wall was a cargo hatch, used for loading when the jet was on the ground. It was just within his reach. Ignoring his better instincts, Saxon kicked out and broke open the control cover with the heel of his combat boot. Barrett saw what he was doing and pressed tighter, but Saxon was committed now. This was how it would end. He kicked again and struck the hatch release panel. Immediately, red strobes and a warning klaxon activated as the door's mechanism stirred into life. But in the next second, all sound was lost as a screaming thunder of air tore across the cargo bay. The hatch began a slow march open, revealing a growing sliver of fathomless black sky beyond. The jet shivered and the nose dropped abruptly. Up in the cockpit, the aircraft's autoflight system would have detected the loss of cabin pressure and immediately attempted to compensate by descending to a lower altitude. Barrett lost his grip and flailed, colliding with a support pillar. Saxon fell against a stowed cargo net and grabbed onto it, the polar cold through the hatch ripping at the skin of his face. Across the threshold, a dash of moonlight glittered off the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. How high are we? How far from land? It was impossible to know. Ben, Namir's voice hummed through his skull. You can't escape. I'm not going to let that happen. As he said the words, the hatch juddered to a halt, half open, and then reversed, sliding toward closure. If he stayed here, he would die. Saxon knew it with utter certainty, the same pure clarity of thinking that had come to him in the Australian wilderness. He would die, this would end, and then there would be justice for Sam and Kano and the others. Saxon threw himself at the gap and leapt into the darkness. 13 kilometers east of Newfoundland, North Atlantic. He never felt the impact when he hit the rolling surface of the sea. It was the only mercy he had. Perhaps it was the shock of the fall. Perhaps his battered body shutting down for a brief moment in some attempt to protect him from greater trauma. At first, Saxon saw only flashes, the silver of the moon on the wave tops below him, a flicker of light from the jet as he spiraled away from it, the navigation lights in the dark. Then he was in the cradle of the shouting winds, snared by gravity. He couldn't see the ocean rushing up to meet him, and for long moments Saxon felt himself disconnect from the real. He could have been floating in the roaring darkness, lost in the starless space. The cold embrace leached the heat from his bones. Saxon squinted through the windburn and made out what he thought was the surface of the water, coming up fast, dappled by the moon's glow. He extended his arms like they had taught him in parachute training, making his whole body an aerofoil, trying to slow himself as much as he could. And then, when he couldn't chance it any longer, he triggered the high fall augmentation implanted in the base of his spine. The device stuttered into life and cast a writhing sphere of electromagnetic energy about him, lightning-like sparks flashing where the field interacted with the air molecules. The implant ran past its tolerance limit, but Saxon re-triggered it, cycling the device over and over. He felt it go hot, smoldering and heavy like a block of newly forged iron embedded in his back. The high fall was never designed to do the job of a parachute. It was a short-span, low-duration technology, a mechanism spun off from safety implants for racing drivers, firefighters, steeplejacks. He screamed as it burned into him, and the blackness engulfed everything. For a moment, at least. Then he was in the frigid rise and fall of the waters, the salt brine smothering him with every new wave. He spun and turned, numb from the waist down. Warning telltales displayed in the corners of his optic field, function indicators for his cyber legs showing red. He choked and shivered, feeling the weight of the augmented limbs pulling on him, robbing him of all buoyancy. The ocean toyed with him and then grew bored. Saxon began to sink, and he couldn't find the strength to fight the icy embrace of the waters.